Gary Graff is a returning guest. He's the author of the new book, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, The Music Fan's Definitive Guide. Great to have you back, Gary.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
As a Van Halen fan, I just want to say thank you for the great interview with Mr. Alex Van Halen. Get that out
Thank
of the
you.
way.
Thank you. That was a fun one to do. What an enigma, and it was nice to tap into some of that.
Hasn't done very many interviews,
No,
so
no, he's done some drum magazines, and now that he has the book out, he's doing that.
yep. And one Van Halen album does make your book from 1991. That's For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. So let's get to the book.
Ah,
Let's get to it. The first line reads, quote, "This is a book that's designed to start arguments."
yes, it is.
Then you go on to write, quote, "The very idea of choosing 501 essential albums from the tens, even hundreds of thousands released during a given decade is preposterous. Yet you were able to do that. How was the process for you in coming up with a list of 501 albums?"
Fun, nerve-wracking, bloodletting. Including the fact that I have one of the contributors who I live with. I got real familiar with the comfortable parts of the patio outside when I had to sleep outside after the arguments. I mean, it's funny because the 90s, a lot of people, some people's reaction is, well, how'd you pick 501 albums from the 90s? A lot of people don't think of it as the great decade it was. And even I was thinking, 501, that's a nice number. That's a large number. And when we compiled the long list of 2,300, from which we had to whittle down the 500 to 501, oops. And it was a lot of discussion, argument. There were some nights at concerts here in Detroit where myself and five other contributors, we were all there covering the concert. And before the show and in between the acts, we were sitting there and getting so worked up to the point where at least one show, one of the other concert goers went and got the usher, thinking we were going to just erupt into a brawl um, while we were arguing. So yeah, it took the time it took. Better part of it took about a month, I would say, and a lot of bouncing around. I created a long spreadsheet, and everybody kind of made their remarks, and we got to a point where, okay, we're comfortable that these are the ones we have to consider. Now it's my job as the editor to pick the 501 that are going to be in the book.
Quite a few writers contribute to the book.
Yeah, about 3 dozen.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
was one of the best parts of it too, is I had done a book series, boy, we're going back almost 3 decades now, called Music, and it wasn't exactly like this, but it did involve a large number of contributors. And that's the fun, is getting to work with your friends and colleagues who, after they see the book, will and how I edited their entries, we'll see if they're still friends and colleagues. But just having that exchange and having the discussions about, some of them are younger than I am, so they were teenagers when In Utero came out, or 10, or the Soundgarden albums, or in some cases the Britney Spears albums. I was covering them at the same time they were fans. Some are a little bit older than I am, so they brought their own perspective to it. So that wound up being a fun part of the book and really helped me hone in on what we wanted the book to be.
Yeah, and it does give you an idea overall what the big albums were each year, not just in rock and roll. I'm going to ask you about those. We're going to really focus on the rock and roll albums, but yeah, like you say, Britney Spears, it covers the whole thing, so it gives you an idea. It actually, by the time I was finished going through the book, it gave me a much better idea looking at these years from afar, noticing the trend with rock and roll in particular by the end of the 90s. And it's not good, I don't think, but we'll get to that.
Sure.
But you see where things were headed. But yeah, you can get into some disagreements and arguments. Like for me, I'm a huge fan of those early bands like Blues Traveler, and Spin Doctors had a huge album. They're not in there, but you can't have them all in there. So you got to determine which ones you want in, what went into the deciding factor as to what's going to go in and what's not.
Yeah, the
Album
word is,
sales, impact.
all of the above, and even the unmentioned. The word essential was really the guide point. Was this essential? Was was this not only a great album musically, and in some cases, for my taste, some of these albums were not, but did they advance the story of the 90s? Did they create a new lane for a kind of music in the 90s? And so all of those were factored in. One thing I want to point out too is that to me, starting with the 90s was great because that was the last golden decade of the album. I think there was a decade when we were still listening to albums as albums. We were, as music fans or music geeks, we were talking about the entire album. We were talking about the deep tracks, the artwork, and everything. The number one album each week on the Billboard charts was still selling 600,000, 800,000, a million copies. So we were focused on consuming albums. And as we got to the end of the decade, and we were getting into Napster and file sharing and P2P and basically the beginnings of the streaming world that are the way we consume music now. So this was it. This was the last, to me, this decade was the last hurrah.
I think also the last decade of FM rock radio having an impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's how I always determined whether I wanted to get an album or not, or CD in those days, early 90s cassettes. How many songs from that album am I hearing on my local rock station? Yeah. One, maybe. Two, yeah, I think I might. Three, oh yeah, I'm going to go get it. And let's see what the rest of it is like. And that changes as we get. And I want to ask that about that around 1996. There's a law that's in place that changes the way things are with radio stations. They go corporate and things change. And then as you said, we go into the streaming services and it just changed the whole, it seems like 100 years ago now. It's crazy.
It does. We definitely are very familiar with the streaming world.
Yeah.
To a fault. But I know I still listen, listen, I'm older than pick your favorite rock out in your yard. So I'm always going to listen to albums and I'm always going to think about things in terms of albums. But, I have kids and now, young grandkids, but also neighbors with young children. And I watch how they're consuming music and they don't have a clue about this way of consuming music.
One upside to it, I would say, though, I actually had on a fellow Detroit native, Brad Talinsky, on recently because he and Jan Uhelski wrote a great book on MC5. Yep. And if there was ever a time to put out a book on a band that people really need to invest their time in listening to their music, would be now, because with streaming services, if you're interested in checking out MC5, it's all there on Spotify. Whereas back in the day, it's only going to be what you hear on the radio. And then you have to make that decision. Am I going to invest a lot of money into buying albums, cassettes, CDs? And you're not going to do that all the time. Whereas now you could just go sample their music, go to YouTube, go to Spotify. So I think that's the upside to it.
Yeah, no, that is a very good point. But the counter, not an entirely a counter argument, but you have to hope people will listen to the albums to understand the band. And now you can create a playlist, on any of the services where you can kind of, like with the MC5 book, if they wanted, they could create a playlist basically of the MC5 songs you as the neophyte listener needs to know. With the 90s, we can and we are planning to create some playlists out there so that you can kind of bounce around the 90s and get a sense of the decade as well. And that is a good thing, but I still think it detracts and deflects from the album experience.
Yeah, you don't connect with the music as much, the album as much. The album is just like a photo album. It's a place in time for the particular artist or band. So let's go all the way back to 1990. And it's interesting. The first year of every decade in music is always left over from the previous decade. The artists who are huge that year often fall off the charts by the middle of the decade, and we have that in the 90s. Albums to make the list for 1990 include MC Hammer, Please Hammer, Don't Hurt 'Em, Extreme 2, Pornography, Sinead O'Connor, I Do Not Want What I Haven't Got. The pop metal bands of the 80s, still doing strong numbers, but we know that would end soon. What stands out to you in terms of rock in the year 1990?
Yeah, like as you say, a transitional year. We had some great arrivals. World Party was still a fresh band, and Goodbye Jumbo was a tremendous album. The Laws, the one and only album by the Laws that was the precursor to Oasis and Blur and everything. You had Jane's Addiction hitting their stride, Sonic Youth becoming part of the major label world. So and MTV still strong, and MTV still having a strong rock presence. What you didn't have was those hair metal, glam metal bands making essential albums. Their best days were behind them, and they were worn out by the touring and the constant demand for new product and the partying. So we very quickly started to see them drop off. But then we started to get bands like the Texas Tornadoes and this new, which is I feel is a rock band in spirit. And so we started to get these new flavors into the rock and roll attitude, and a harbinger of what the decade might become.
I want to talk about Jane's Addiction. One album that stands out for me from 1990, Ritual de lo Habitual, Jane's Addiction. Of course, the band made news this summer for the meltdown Perry Farrell had on stage during a show in Boston in July. But Jane's Addiction is such an interesting band to talk about. Those early albums, like Nothing Shocking and Ritual de lo Habitual, are so good. Nothing Shocking is ahead of its time and been caught stealing a huge hit in 1990. Although they have reformed over the years, it's been with different members. That original lineup of Farrell, Dave Navarro on guitar, drummer Stephen Perkins, and bassist Eric Avery, so special. And I would have loved to have seen what that lineup could have done if they hadn't split in 1991. What is your opinion of Jane's Addiction in terms of their influence on the 90s?
Well, they were definitely, and part of that influence comes with Lollapalooza, which they headlined the first tour, and what Perry did. They were alternative rock with a capital A and a capital R. They were this harbinger of here's what else rock and roll can be. And yeah, it can be, we can take from Zeppelin, but we can take from Sun Ra. And we can mesh this all together into this weird circuitous roadmap of a sound that's different and almost indescribable, and yet has so many familiar sonic touchstones that it draws everybody in, and it excites you as a listener about these new directions they're going in. So they were, in a lot of ways, they were sending up the flare or raising the flag, or pick your cliche here, of what was to come, of what we call the alternative rock revolution.
Yeah, much like Paul's Boutique from Beastie Boys, I think of
Right.
that too. How ahead of time those songs were from that album, where they're sampling and yeah, it was a sign of what was to come. 1991, that's the year that launched the grunge era. Pearl Jam released 10. Nirvana released Nevermind. Soundgarden released Bad Motorfinger. Temple of the Dog self-titled album came out that year. As a child of the 80s, for me, it took me about a year to really embrace all of that. I was kind of like, nah, Van Halen. I'm into Van Halen, Warrant, Winger, Kiss, the metal bands from the 80s. But once I embraced it, man, I was all in. It took a little while. How did you receive the music and those albums that I just mentioned when they hit the FM airwaves and MTV in 1991?
Well, you have to remember. So I'm a working music journalist at the time. And I'm more than a decade into my career, and I loved it. I really did. It was nice to hear. I had tired of a lot of the 80s rock. I was looking and wanting and hoping for something new, just like as somebody who grew up in the 70s. New wave and punk came in just at the right time for me. I was getting tired of the familiar of that decade. So I was growing tired of what we were hearing rock do in the 80s, and was ready for something new. I would almost say that in addition to Jane's Addiction, in addition to Ritual, Ragged Glory, Neil Young and Crazy Horse
Yeah.
helped set the table for 91. There are a lot of, I remember speaking to the guys from Pearl Jam and the guys from Nirvana, and they had, even though they were writing and recording their music at the time, they felt like when Ragged Glory came out, it was really a beacon about what they wanted to do.
Pearl Jam were huge fans of Neil Young, and then they
Oh
had
yeah.
Neil Young on stage during the MTV Music Awards. I remember that very well. Did you sense how big Nirvana was going to become with
Not
that
when
album?
not when I got my advanced cassette of In Utero.
Yeah.
No. I had seen them actually come
Or
through.
Nevermind, I think, right? Nevermind, you're talking.
And Nevermind,
Right.
yes. I had I had seen them, come through before on the first album, and they had made, just bringing in Dave Grohl was such a huge change all the way around with his musical sensibilities. But no, nothing told you this was going to be a chart-topping, hit-making. In fact, I remember laughing, and they might have even written in the review of that album that, if there was a God or if there was justice, this would be the biggest album of the year or something like that. Never expecting. It was too different and it was too raw, to really think about, to think about on radio stations that were still playing Dokken and Rat
Yeah.
and Van Halen and
Yeah.
and Zeppelin.
Oh, Zeppelin was the big thing. Yeah. Yeah. The Nirvana, I remember that song came out. Mr. Big had the hit single To Be With You.
Yeah.
Like it was this
Yeah, we're
period of,
getting power ballads and stuff like that. So no, you never could have predicted what was going to happen. Pearl Jam sounded a little more like the mainstream rock and was produced a little more like
yeah.
mainstream rock at that time. And so was Soundgarden on the heavier end.
Yeah. And Pearl Jam wasn't happy about the production and they reissued
Later on, right, they did a
a
remix.
remix the way
And
they wanted it to sound. But at
right,
the time, yeah, they want the production was a little more Def Leppard like,
right.
arena rock like than what they
And
had
then
wanted it to sound. And you could hear that in the future Pearl Jam albums. 1992, another huge year. We have Alice in Chains with Dirt, Soul Asylum, Grave Dancers Union. Eric Clapton's Unplugged was big that year.
yeah,
Tori Amos, Little Earthquakes, Pantera, Vulgar Display of Power, Annie Lennox, Diva. That was big, I remember. The Cure, one of my favorite bands. Wish, love their new album, by the way. The Beastie Boys, Check Your Head, Stone Temple Pilots, Core, REM, Automatic for the People. Neil Young, one of my favorite Neil Young albums, hands down Harvest Moon. Rage Against the Machine, their self-titled album came out that year. Peter Gabriel's Us, Gin Blossoms, New Miserable Experience, The Black Crowes, The Southern Harmony and Musical Companion. A huge year for rock, but I do want to zero in on REM. They were huge in the 90s and they signed that record-breaking deal with Warner Brothers, I think it was.
yep.
That album has Everybody Hurts, Drive, Man on the Moon. In the book, writer Howard Kramer writes of the band's eighth studio album, quote, the quadruple platinum Automatic for the People represented a musical high point in a career that had only trended up. Perhaps it was the fact that REM didn't tour behind 1991's Out of Time, a massive hit album, and the world was hungry for the band. No matter how it set the table with Automatic for the People, REM delivered a clear-eyed, full-throated masterpiece. Where do you rank this album on REM's list of albums, their discography? Is it their finest moment? That's a lot to ask because they had some
Yeah.
great albums.
I don't know about the finest moment. I'd put it in the top 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Certainly, they had with Out of Time, they had kind of smacked everybody upside the head and said, here's what we can be. Here's what we're not going to be tied to being the jangly alternative pop band that we were. I shouldn't say pop, but the jangly alternative rock band that we were, throughout the 80s and into Green. We've got other areas we want to go in. And so with Automatic for the People, they continued to refine that and say, here's how many feels we can take on. Here's how much emotion we have as a band. And it really, it was another masterwork. And they're one of these bands that we struggled with in the book, and even more so in the 80s book that's coming, because every album was significant in their catalog. And they were such a significant band. But there's no room for everyone to be in there. So how do we deal with this? And, Automatic was, of course, Automatic to have in the book, Automatic for the People. And it is, like I said, I would put it in the top 3. I'd bounce that around with a little bit with Murmur and maybe Document. Out of time certainly belongs in the discussion.
There is that faction of the REM fan base who love the old school original days, the
Yeah.
college radio REM days. But to me, I followed them right up until they disbanded. I thought they were still putting out viable music right up until the end. It's kind of disappointed that they pulled the plug on it. And I wish that they would come back and do it again. But I totally get why they have, as artists, I think they knew when it was time to walk away. I think
Yeah,
they felt that there was the right time. But I just, they're all alive and well. I just would love to see them come back.
I think they're number one for a rock fan. They're number one on the reunion list. But they've done it. Listen, we got to give them credit for saying we're not coming back and really not coming back.
Right.
We can't say the same about how many other bands.
And I'm sure there's been a lot of money put on the table.
I know there has been.
Okay.
It was nice to see them do what they did with the Songwriters Hall of Fame induction this year, and see them do a little bit together, be interviewed together and do all of that.
Yeah, Michael Stipe did a rare interview.
Yeah.
On the podcast Broken Record, I heard him talking. And I thought it was interesting. If there's one part of his skills, set of skills, is his voice. He likes his voice.
Oh yeah,
I thought that was interesting.
And he uses it very well.
Yeah, great lyricist. Although we never sure what he's talking about.
Well, right, and well, he's a poet.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And a really good singer. And that was one of those bands. And we know more than a few of them. We're just all the elements coalesced to make 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 equals more than 4.
Monster's another one. Monster was
that was a great album too. That's the one we left out. And believe me, it was a wrestle, but I felt like of their albums in the 90s, not the essential one or the least essential one. And I wanted to get New Adventures in Hi-Fi in there because I felt like not only was that such a clever and creative album, and not only were the songs really great, but that also helped launch a way of making albums that other bands took on. I mean, Jackson Browne had done a little bit of it with Running on Empty in the 70s, but with REM, it was like this beacon to other bands that were around at the time and bands that were on the runway that, hey, here's a way to make an album. Here's a way to do something really cool and kind of clever. So
yeah, 1993, Sting's Sumner Tales. I remember that so well. I had Fields of Gold, If I Ever Lose My Faith in You, big on the radio, big album for him. Siamese Dream from Smashing Pumpkins. Lenny Kravitz, Are You Gonna Go My Way? Counting Crows, August and Everything After. Pearl Jam Versus. Nirvana, In Utero. Meatloaf, Bad Out of Hell 2, Back into Hell. Sheryl Crow, Tuesday Night Music Club. The Cranberries were big that year. Everybody else is doing it, so why can't we? And we can't forget about Aerosmith, who released Get a Grip. 4 top 30 singles. Living on the Edge, #1 on the rock charts for 9 weeks. Crazy, Amazing, Crying, other big singles from that album. Their first #1 album and their best-selling album worldwide, 20 million sales globally. This leads to my question. Does chart success equal quality of music, specifically with this album? What do you think of Get a Grip? Because Aerosmith, old school Aerosmith, is timeless.
It is, and so was new school Aerosmith in the 90s. They wrote good songs. They had good oversight. Management at the record company, production. They had people who could steer these guys towards really good commercial rock music. Now, I will say when I put on an Aerosmith record, it's usually going to be Rocks or Get Your Wings, and it's, Toys in the Attic. It's not necessarily going to be Get a Grip or Pump, but those are really good albums. They showed what a really good group of players can do with really good songcraft. Okay, and yeah, this was pretty, down the, say for like a Janie's Got a Gun. It's pretty down the middle of the road songwriting. But to have those guys play it and Steven Tyler sing it really elevates it above the normal pop act.
So true. And I
Uh,
love Pump. I
oh yeah,
would
Pump. No, Pump was. I like Pump better than Get a Grip, to be honest.
exact same here. Same here. Yeah. 1994, interesting. We had the Page and Plant reunion album, No Quarter. The Eagles' Hell Freezes Over. Tom Petty's Wildflowers came out that year, another hit for TP. But it's also the year that marked the launch of quite a few big bands and artists that were new to the scene. Weezer released their self titled debut, known as the Blue Album. Oasis released their debut, Definitely Maybe. Dave Matthews Band, their debut album, Under the Table and Dreaming, came out. Live's third album, Throwing Copper, that introduced them to a huge audience. Beck released Mellow Gold, featuring the surprise hit Loser. Bush released 16 Stone. Green Day, Dookie, Offspring's Smash, Holes Live Through This. And then you have Hootie and the Blowfish, Cracked Rear View, which was huge. Quite
Yeah.
a transitional year in rock. Is this the most shift changing year from the decade?
One of them, like think about what you just went through when you listed 93. I mean, very, very shift changing as well. Some of this was in what you talked about with radio earlier. We began to see more different radio formats, more narrow casting. They tightened their individual demographics. The silver-ish lining to that is it made room for more different kind of musics to be heard. You weren't just counting on your AOR station to play you everything, but there was hot CHR and mellow CHR and hot rock and pop rock and all the I forget all the slogans that
Yeah,
were around
soft
then.
rock, mellow rock.
But there was a lot of room for stuff, and then a lot of room for crossover. I mean, Hootie and the Blowfish got played on what was called CHR, what we would call Top 40. They got played on Adult Contemporary. They got played on some alternative radio stations, because they were out there touring with Toad the Wet Sprocket and Soul Asylum, and they were embraced as part of that community too. So there was just more room being made for more different kinds of music to be exposed, and you saw that, but that had begun already, but you were seeing it reflected in what was being released by major labels, and major labels were really still in control.
That Hootie album broke the record set by Boston for
Right, was the
debut album
biggest
sales. Yeah.
biggest debut album, and it was a good. It still holds up.
Yeah,
You
it
listen
is.
to
It
it,
is.
yeah.
It is a solid record. The record was then broken. If I'm not mistaken, Alanis Morissette broke the record with Jagged Little Pill a year or two later, which we're going to get to. Yeah. Yeah. The 90s again, MTV was still huge in the mid 90s. That was coming to an end soon.
Yeah,
I
it
remember
was.
TRL would be like, they're playing 30 seconds of the video and that's it. That's when you knew that things were changing with MTV.
Very much.
Gary Graff is the author of 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, the Music Fan's Definitive Guide. So 1995, we see the post-Nirvana era officially underway since the Unplugged album came out in 94 after Kurt Cobain's death. This is the year Dave Grohl launches Foo Fighters and their self-titled debut is released. I shouldn't say there because really it was all Dave on that album, right? He played all the instruments.
Right.
They've gone on to become one of the biggest of the still standing rock bands. What was your first impression of that album? And did you expect big things from Grohl and Foo Fighters?
That was one I was not at all surprised that it became very successful very quickly. I mean, he had something to jump off from, and this was the first thing out of the box from the Nirvana camp afterwards. And then you listen to it and you realize, dude's a pop songwriter.
Very radio
He,
friendly, not a
he
bad,
just
and that's not an insult. That's not
no.
putting it down. They were just really
Listen, the Beatles were a pop band.
sure.
But he just cranks up the guitars and the adrenaline and the drums. And I heard that album and I said, something's going to happen here. And then of course we got to the color and the shape, and then it was yes, he knows what he's doing. He knows what it's almost like somebody slipped him the secret template of what a great rock band is.
Yeah.
But he knew he was a student of rock. He was a fan of rock. And when I say fan of rock, I mean all rocks. This is a guy who listened to the Archies and he listened to the Stooges. And all of that was part of what he wrote for Foo Fighters.
Yeah, who knew that quiet guy behind the drum kit could
No.
write songs so well, and so many of them. Other albums from '95: Oasis, "What's the Story," "Morning Glory," huge. Smashing
Yeah.
Pumpkins, "Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness." The Beatles anthology that year was huge. Radiohead's "The Bends," Alanis Morissette, "Jagged Little Pill." That's the one. 1995 came out. Garbage released their self-titled debut, and No Doubt, "Tragic Kingdom." That was the ska rock, a resurgence of ska rock. Looking at the albums from 1996 in the book, I'm realizing that this may be the year when the classic rock artists started to decline on the charts. Hip hop was huge that year, while the standout rock albums were Matchbox 20's "Yourself or Someone Like You," REM's "New Adventures in Hi-Fi," Rage Against the Machine's "Evil Empire," Weezer's "Pinkerton," Sublime's self-titled album, Tool "Enema," Sheryl Crow's self-titled, The Wallflowers' "Bringing Down the Horse," Beck "Odelay," Cake, "Fashion Nugget." So mostly newer bands and artists, but it was also the year Kiss had their huge reunion. Maybe the first of the big nostalgia tours that would follow. We could have had Van Halen with David Lee Roth. That could have happened in '96, but that fizzled out at the MTV Awards. What do you think of the year 1996 for rock?
Another year of just lots of different stuff. I mean, again, you just mentioned this wonderful range, and let's not forget about the swing movement that
Yeah.
was going on at the time. You had Brian Setzer from the Stray Cats going in there, Squirrel Nut Zippers.
Yeah. What about
You know,
Mighty Boss Tones, right?
yeah,
Wasn't that?
well, they were in that range, in that around then too. And then you had Americana coming up as Americana. '90s was the decade where we had rock bands that weren't country enough to be called country. So what we were going to call them, and we found this term for Wilco and Sunvolt and others, even a veteran like Emmylou Harris, Americana. So the splintering was continuing. Maybe there's a nicer term than splintering, but there were more forks in the road to follow. If you wanted to follow the Hootie and the Blowfish trail, you had Matchbox 20. If you wanted to follow something heavier, you had Tool to listen to. So there was, and then you had, like you said, hip hop. EDM was starting to become a commercial factor. Something. When you had Fatboy Slim and DJ Shadow starting to do things that were radio friendly, that were mainstream friendly, and it was tough for rock to get a foothold anymore. There was no, there was harder to get a consensus about anything. So it was hard to be a big rock band anymore.
Which makes me wonder, because we mentioned Van Halen, and I think about how they started off that decade really strong with "For
Huge.
Unlawful Carnal Knowledge," huge. The song "Right Now," I think, was so huge in terms of them transitioning over into the new decade. They showed that they could still, thrive, not just survive in the '90s, and it really started out so well. They keep Balance in 1995, a number one album. Slight fall off, I think, from "For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge," but still solid. But then the band fell apart, and I wonder what Van Halen could have been if Sammy stayed in the band, because "Humans Being" came out in '96, and I thought, man, this is a badass song. With this, I'm real excited about where they're going with this, but it all fell apart. What do you think about Van Halen in the '90s? What
No,
could have been?
I agree with you. I think there was, they were separated by non-musical issues within the band, which was too bad. I think I enjoyed where the music was going, even if it didn't seem to have the same mainstream rock appeal. I didn't think it had to. They made their case as a commercial band. So now let's see where, kind of where they tried to go on Van Halen 3, but with Sammy's pop smart songwriting sensibility. What could that have been? Maybe he could arrange some of that in to song format. And even if we weren't getting the jumps, the right nows, whatever, I think we would have gotten some very interesting songs, and I say songs that you could listen to, but with Eddie and maybe Alex taking it out a little bit more with the playing and the arrangements and what they might have done.
To give you an example, we mentioned Alex Van Halen. You had a chance to interview Alex, and this song that he put out called Unfinished, which is accompanies the audio version of the book, that was written back in 1996,
Yeah.
around the time of the Twister soundtrack, and it was called Between Us Two. And Sammy had put lyrics down on it, and they were not happy with the lyrics, so they ditched the song. Now we're hearing that song without the vocals.
Right.
But that gives you an idea of where they were headed. Very, they called it kind of Led Zeppelin like, almost. That's their Stairway to Heaven. It's very different. The opening sounds almost David Gilmour like, and it's a 7 minute, 6.5 minute track. Again, that makes me wonder what could have been, you know?
Oh, you can, and I think you could even hear on Van Halen 3 what some of the, I mean, you hear Unfinished, well, in the hearing Unfinished, you see you could hear where their heads were at when they were going into Van Halen 3. He just needed a collaborator who was a better fit to pool some of that stuff into song shape. But I would love to hear a great instrumental Eddie Van Halen album.
Oh, Van Halen fans have been saying that for years, and it never happened.
It's funny they say that, and then when it comes out, they're going to say, "Oh, it doesn't sound like ain't talking about love." That's what I want. What is this crap? When in fact, it would be genius.
Yeah. Well, Eddie was still developing. He was still trying new things, new sounds, new textures. He was trying all this different. And of course, as we know, he was still tinkering away at the guitar. He's eventually the EVH model would come out. But it's just too bad because so many years lost from after Van Halen 3, which came out in 98. It was just a dark period, and it was really a bummer. But that's when I realized I was really a Van Halen fan, because a lot of people were dropping off. I was like, no, I'm still Team Van Halen here. I'm hoping for something, but you started to lose hope.
This will not happen, but I would love to see Wolfgang get into the vaults with his ear, knowing where his dad was headed and knowing what his dad's intent was. I mean, I think Alex knew it too, but I think Wolfgang maybe knows even more what his dad was trying to do, what was getting his dad off. And I would love to see him have some say and do some curation of the music and bring it out for us to hear.
Yeah,
I think his take would be really, really interesting and really valid.
Sure. He said in the Q&A recently to promote the book that he does plan on still working on what's in there. But he also said Wolfgang, maybe 20, 30 years from now, Wolfgang will put out a bunch of stuff too. It just tells you how much is in those vaults you got to go through.
He was a playing monster. When anybody you talk to who worked with Eddie, it was like he was just playing all the time, and he built 5150 to be able to walk to his studio and pass out there, which happened a lot too. Very
much like Prince.
Yeah.
Prince is all that material. Yeah. They said that in his vault there, what do they call it? They have a name for it. I can't remember, but you could barely shut the door. There's so much stuff. There's like tapes right up until the door. You have to like push it in just to shut it. There's so much in there. Yeah. Dave Grohl's Foo Fighters continued their rise in 97 with The Color and the Shape, which you had mentioned. Rap is still huge. Country's growing bigger and bigger now with Shania Twain's Come On Over out that year. In Sync marks the explosion of boy bands. Some veteran artists mark comebacks. Bob Dylan's Time Out of Mind came out in 97. Love that album, and I love the song Not Dark Yet. Brilliant, along with John Fogerty's Blue Moon Swamp. And David Bowie put out Earthling, too. But not a great year for rock in 1997. U2's return, highly anticipated. The album Pop didn't do nearly as well as hoped. I don't think it even made the book, did it? Did Pop make? No. The only
U2 in the book is Achtung.
Oh, which is an amazing
seminal album, and Pop just not even an essential album in U2's catalog, much less for the decade it was released. And there was a bit of that in the book. There's no Jackson Browne in here. There's no James Taylor, no Joni Mitchell. There are just a number of those artists who, and that was that same criteria. Well, these are good, and there were some good albums. I thought Pop was a good album, but they're not even essential albums in the artist's catalog. much less
Yeah.
for the entire decade. So, it'll be different in the 80s and the 70s when we do those. But
What did you think of him? I am a huge Blind Melon fan. A fellow writer of Greg Prado is a huge fan. He wrote a couple great books on Shannon Hoon and Blind Melon. And I mentioned Blues Traveler and Spin Doctors. Were you a fan of those bands of that era? Kind of almost a throwback to the hippie era.
yeah, they were commercial, what I call commercial jam bands.
Yeah.
So not quite Fish, but
Fish.
not
Yeah.
quite Fish, but these were bands that tried hard to have songs and did have some songs in there. Now they were a good group. For me, they tended group of bands. For me, they tended to blur together a little bit. And yeah, they all had something that distinguished them from one another. But the whole scene felt a little bit, I don't know, not
Genuine or
no, it's certainly genuine. That was the thing.
yeah.
The whole horde, what we call the horde scene, was certainly genuine, but maybe a little myopic, maybe just a little, head too far up their own choose your orifice type of playing that was good but not Fish or
And
not the Grateful Dead.
and you talk about an example of the sophomore slump. Spin Doctors' first album, Pocket Full of Kryptonite, was huge in '91, and then the follow-up album, Turn It Upside Down, didn't do much, if anything, at all.
Typical case in point of your whole life to write your first album
Yeah,
and very little time to do your second.
yeah. I never felt it happening in the moment, but taking a step back and looking at it now through your book, this gave me a great chance to kind of step back and look at everything. I think you see the signs of rock declining in this year, particularly late '90s. Did you feel that way putting together the book? Did you have any different opinions of the '90s after you put it together, being able to look at it from
Yeah.
as a
I don't
whole?
I don't know if it was so much about rock declining as it was in other forms of music ascending.
Yeah.
And rock was maybe in a coasting mode at that point and wasn't producing the masterpieces. It's certainly not at a volume that it had previously. And then you have, and getting the '97, certainly, you had, country was just ramrodding its way through the decade. West Coast hip hop, and then East Coast getting woken up and answering the call to try to combat the West Coast. You had those things happening, EDM continuing to surface here and there. You just had a lot of other kinds of music that I think interested listeners more. They sounded fresher. With rock, you knew you were going to get guys playing guitars, bass, drums, maybe keyboard, the occasional harmonica. And you kind of knew what a rock band was going to sound like. One of the things that made a Pavement so interesting, or when we talked earlier about Jane's Addiction, at the middle of the decade, was they took rock and turned it on its ear a little bit, or on its head. And that's what hip hop was doing. That's what country was doing, by the time we get into '97. And so it usurped that position that rock had, even if it wasn't that hard to find a good rock album, but it was harder to find an essential rock album.
Yeah. And it started to become less dangerous, less of the music that your parents don't want you to listen to.
Yeah, I mean, we still had like the Deftones.
Yeah.
I thought that came out and really was the arrival of a new sound, and an interesting new sound. So you still had bands like that.
Yeah.
But
Isn't it crazy that Disney held the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremonies? And you're thinking, rock and roll has become that safe. It's now Disney. Ozzy Osbourne is getting inducted into the Rock and Roll of Fame,
well,
and I'm watching it on Disney Plus.
yep.
Right? I
Right.
mean, there was a time when parents were like, Ozzy Osbourne is the devil. You are not going to that concert this
Yeah.
weekend.
But we were
Right?
way, even in the '90s, we were way past that.
Yeah.
As soon as corporate America, corporate international figured out that that the Aussies and the Marilyn Mansons and the so-called dangerous bands of the world could make them a lot of money, they were welcomed with open arms.
Yeah, I think they pushed the envelope so far with the Marilyn Mansons and that kind of thing that it was like, how much more can you do to shock anybody? You really can't anymore. But
and rap and look what gangster rap was
yes,
doing. That was more shocking than real life in
yep,
some ways.
yep. Speaking of corporate, let's get to it. I want to ask you about rock radio in the 90s. This is from a 2022 article I found on the web. The website is 35,000watts.com. This is the article. President Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act of 1996, a landmark overhaul of telecommunications law that completely changed the landscape of broadcasting in the United States. Billed as a way to allow any business to compete in the communications sphere, some of the most damaging provisions instead drove many small broadcasters out of the market while allowing large corporations to scoop up broadcast licenses and reduce the number of independent voices in communities across the country. Contrary to the stated intentions of allowing more businesses to operate in the communication space, the actual result of the act was a flurry of mergers and acquisitions as corporate media giants bought out small local broadcasters. This occurred because previously there were strict limits to how many broadcast stations, both TV and radio, a single entity could own. There were also rules about cross ownership, i.e., owning a radio station and a TV station in the same market. Within 5 years of the act, radio station ownership dropped from 5,100 owners to 3,800. This trend has continued to the present with corporate behemoth iHeartMedia, formerly Clear Channel, owning over 800 plus stations across the country. In both radio and TV, consolidation occurred at a pace never before seen, massively reducing the number of independent broadcasters in communities across the United States. Yeah, it goes on to talk about the negative effects of not just the programming, but people in the business were losing jobs. I worked in the radios in the 90s, right up and through into the 2000s, and it changed drastically. But from a listener's standpoint, gone were the days of bands emerging out of one market. You get support from an independent station. Next thing you know, the band takes off. So a two-part question for you, Gary. What do you think of FM rock radio in the 90s? And do you feel the changes since 1996 have had an effect on rock music?
Oh yeah, without question. I mean, what you had happen was there are fewer and fewer owners, and I don't know, in 2024, do we have 10 or a dozen owners anymore at this point? It was easy for them to consolidate, and one programmer could program every station that company owned. And you brought in consultants, and the consultants were always around, but you brought them in as well, and it really homogenized the landscape, and there was less space, like you just said. It was harder to break an act out of a single market, because a DJ couldn't, an air personality couldn't pick up an album and say, I love this, I want to play it for my people. He or she did not have the room in their day-to-day. They were basically presented with a script for the show. Here's the song you're playing, here's the ad you're playing, for your entire shift. There is no wiggle room here.
I'm getting PTSD.
I know. I mean, and I was,
the log.
I was covering radio actually at the time, and was doing some radio adjacent work at the time, and writing about the almost instantaneous impact that you saw. I mean, I heard stations that I went to bed one night and I came on the next day, and it wasn't that they had switched formats, but they had definitely switched attitude and mission. And it was, it shrunk the universe of songs and bands that were being played. And it was a great detriment, especially to rock.
Yeah, I worked at a rock station in Connecticut for a long time, and I remember the program director battling with the corporate people that would come in, and they would soften up the playlist. And I remember, for some reason, this sticks out to me, and I love Genesis, but we were a harder rock station, and then they wanted us to play Genesis.
Invisible Touch?
No, from that album, In Too Deep.
Yeah.
Which is a really song. That's
it's an AC song.
It's an AC song. And I remember my program director just coming out of the meetings like he just was red face and just and there was nothing you could do about it.
Yeah,
And so you'd start playing it, and then the playlist would get shorter and
yeah,
shorter and shorter. We played Creed with Arms Wide Open so many times.
yeah.
We used to just joke about it. We're like, I can't take it anymore. I just can't play this song every single night. And it was sad because FM radio to me was an art form growing up. I wish I was born earlier because in the late 60s and 70s,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
it was amazing. And yeah,
Yeah,
it
you would hear more than one song, from an album, and that is something that actually started changing in the 80s, but became more pronounced in the 90s
yeah,
too, is the record companies making a plan. And it was one single at a time. Don't go on this other song yet. We're not ready
right.
for it. Here's what we're going to do. And then when you combine that with the landscape you've just described about in the radio world and ownership,
Consultants, yeah.
and everybody was a lot more complicit in making it work that way. So yeah, I remember, when I was a kid, you heard 3, 4 tracks from Toys in the Attic, and you heard one track at a time from Get a Grip,
And you
spaced
knew and
spaced apart.
yeah, and you knew the DJs, you connected with them. They all
Yeah,
had their own personality, and the
yeah,
stations had their own personality. You just knew. You
yeah.
just knew that you were listening to a particular station.
And listen, in the 90s, we still had air personalities on for just about every air shift. You listen now to these stations, and some stations, if they're lucky, they have one
I was
who's
just
actually
about to
who's
say,
who's
yep.
actually in the market, and they're not even live. They're
I was
cut.
just
They're
about to
cut.
say, yep.
Yeah,
Voice
they're
tracking, right?
yeah,
Voice track. When that started, that was in the early 2000s. They were showing me how to voice track. And it was like voice track. So that meant you could put together I try to explain it to people who don't know, and they're just it blows their mind. But all of the songs in a 4 hour shift were already in the computer, and then you could hit the record button, record your opening, and then you could move that opening, the audio, just so
yep,
it's just so, and you could do a whole 4 hour shift in 15 minutes. Literally, there were guys that were just blowing through it, not doing any preparation, just here is that was boom, boom, boom. I'm getting the hell out of here. And they had no interest in the music. And it was so bland and so boring. And I remember thinking to myself, a lot of the jocks were like, this is great, man. I get to pre-record so I can head out early. I'm like, this is not good.
right.
I mean, this
We
is not.
lost we lost that dialogue about the music
Yeah.
that we used to have. It was a real community.
Yeah.
The even though we were all apart, but it was a real community. And
Oh, Detroit, man. You had
oh,
RIF.
we had WRIF,
Yeah.
we had WABX for a while, WLLZ. Even and a lot of stations that came and tried to claw their way into the market, and even if they weren't successful, they raised a ruckus trying to
Yeah.
do it.
How long were you in Detroit? Because I asked that because were you there when Stern was in Detroit?
I was not. No, I came to
No.
Detroit in '82, but they were still talking about them,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
you'd imagine.
Yep. Yeah, 1998. Let's move on to that year now. Hole's Celebrity Skin, Beck Mutation, Goo Goo Dolls, Dizzy Up the Girl, Kid Rock, Devil Without a Cause, Queens of the Stone Age's self-titled debut, Korn, Follow the Leader, Bare Naked Ladies, Stunt. I'm not sure what stands out about that year other than I would just say it's the beginning of the rap rock new metal phenomenon that emerged by the
Yeah.
end of the decade.
Well,
Limp Bizkit was about to become huge, Slipknot, Linkin
yeah,
Park. Yeah.
Rage Against the Machine had actually, kind of started that, and then Deftones to a degree, and then you had, people come along like a Kid Rock, or Beck was kind of perfecting it into that crazy stew he made. I mean, Beck was really almost taking us back to Sergeant Pepper's and their Satanic Majesty's Request. It was really was psychedelic in that kind of thing, but you had a lot of stuff again. I mean, I hate to keep harping on the variety thing, but you had a lot of rock artists taking very different approaches to rock music at the time, and being embraced. I mean, we had System of a Down emerged that year, and which was something kind of new. I think Disturbed was coming out around then, if I recall. Where Slipknot was starting to make noise, these early Ozfest bands. you were almost seeing more invention on the extremes. How not the band, but the extremes. How soft can we get, or how heavy and abrasive can we get? And that's where the real invention was happening. Rather than on the mainstream part of rock.
Yeah, Rod Stewart by the end of the '90s started to mellow. I think he was starting to do the
Doing
standards.
the songbook. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, yeah. So we had some stuff that we get behind. Monster Magnet. I loved having stoner rock, and you
Yeah.
mentioned Queens of the Stone Age coming out of Caius. It was good to have that in. But as we were talking about before, rock's foothold had slipped, and I think, I honestly think the record companies didn't care as much. They were looking for the pop stars. They were looking for the rappers. They were looking for the hybrids that would sell records. And rock, they felt, was always going to be there. And if something hit, like Follow the Leader or System of a Down's first album, all's well and good. But they weren't behind rock like they were at the beginning of the decade, certainly.
Well, maybe the biggest surprise of the '90s comes at the end of the decade. 1999, Santana releases Supernatural, and you write the entry on this album in the book. You lead with, quote, "It's fair to say that the world was not clamoring for a new Santana album in 1999. It's true. Released June 15th, 1999. Number one in 11 countries, including the US, stayed at the top for 12 non-consecutive weeks, 30 million copies sold worldwide. Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year. Smooth, featuring Rob Thomas of Matchbox 20, number one for 12 weeks. And the track Maria Maria with the Product, G&B, and Wyclef Jean, also number one. Clapton was on there, Lauryn Hill, Dave Matthews, among others. He's around 52 years old when this happens. And by the mid 90s, he was without a label. 4 years later, this happens. And you do quote Carlos in the book. He literally received a supernatural message telling him this was coming.
Yeah, that's Carlos. Carlos, whenever you talk to Carlos, I call it a bong hit of an interview.
Did he tell you this? Is that where this quote? Okay.
Yeah. You were gonna get into the cosmic with him. But this was just perfect packaging with the right person. And you can blame Frank Sinatra's duets album for this,
yeah,
and for the trend that followed, because they put Frank together with a bunch of mostly younger artists to do that, and did very well with it. Pete, Clive Davis and Pete Gamberg at Arista Records hit on the notion. Clive had signed Carlos to Columbia back in 1968 and loved the guy, bona fide. And I was seeing Carlos live at the time, and he hadn't lost a step as a musician.
No.
But he didn't care about the commercial world. He wanted to sell records, but he's not going to write a Smooth or a Maria Maria or any of the hits on that album. So Clive put them together with the right person. And they were collaborations, at least. Carlos brought his flavor to Smooth, and he brought it to Maria Maria and all the songs on the album. But in collaboration with these artists who, in turn, loved Carlos Santana and understood his value as an artist. So this wasn't as cynical an exercise as some that would come in its wake, like the other two they tried to do with Santana.
The All Covers album, I thought was pretty cool.
Well, that was good. No,
that was the one, Def Leppard Photograph, I thought was great, but I think it ran its course pretty quickly.
Yeah, but in this case, I mean, you had it, the timing was right, the artistry was correct, the personalities were right, and the concept was fresh. And it really, now he can continue to sell out amphitheaters forever.
Yeah,
because people want to go hear Smooth.
And good for him, man, because Carlos is one of the all-time greats.
Oh, and he still plays great.
Yep.
I mean, he still plays fabulous. So, it's nice when that works out. When it comes to rock in '99, though, we also had the arrival of the White Stripes first.
White Stripes, self-titled debut. Yeah.
And this was going to help launch a garage rock, whatever. We called it garage rock. It was punk,
Yeah.
But this was really, the first shot in something that would become the breath of fresh air for rock in the aughts, in the 2000s.
Yeah.
And I think, that was a very, very important arrival.
Blink 182, Enema of the
Yeah.
State came out that year too. Rage Against the Machine, The Battle of Los Angeles. And I can't believe we haven't talked about the Red Hot Chili Peppers because in the 90s they were huge.
Yeah.
Californication came out in 1999. Big fan of the Chili Peppers?
I am. I
Yeah.
am. I actually, so I met the Chili Peppers when they were recording their second album here in Detroit with George Clinton.
Oh, that's going
And
back. Yeah.
and so put all those personalities together in a studio and you are guaranteed a good time.
Yes.
Um, but it was fun to watch the process and watch Flea record his bass parts and Anthony make up lyrics on the spot. And they had their ups and downs, of course.
Sure.
They really hit big at the beginning, in the beginning of the decade.
Blood Sugar Sex
With
Magic.
Sugar Sex Magic, and then to come back with Californication and a real retrenchment, and the return of John Frusciante to
Yes.
the band, and to be able to put together a 2-disc set. We forget
Stadium
that,
Arcadium, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
right. And we forget that in the 90s, an an individual album, which was a CD, was the length of a 2-record set, an old 2-record vinyl set. When you had Stadium Arcadium or you had, Smashing Pumpkins, you know, do that. These were 4-record sets, and that they were of high quality music, was mind boggling, really.
Red Hot Chili Peppers, I think, still great band, still putting out some great
Yeah.
music.
Yeah, no, they have remained fairly consistent.
What?
Just when lightning strikes, and you're not necessarily going to have it happen like that commercially again, but creatively, they're still there.
Yeah, we didn't mention there's that interesting time period where Dave Navarro is in the band for one
For,
album, one
for
hot
one
minute.
album in a minute, and
Yeah,
it was literally one
one.
hot minute,
Yes.
and it was a minute better left forgotten.
Yeah, there's
It
some.
wasn't terrible, but it didn't gel.
Yeah, there's that magic with Frusciante.
Yeah,
And
yeah, no,
thankfully he made it out of that decade because he was in really bad shape, John Frusciante.
yeah.
There's a
Oh
video
yeah.
of him when he was in the throes of addiction. That was scary. He's
No,
one of the he is somebody who cranks out music. Like they were talking one time about all the albums he's put out as a solo artist and with the Chili Peppers. It's just music comes out of him
yeah.
constantly.
No, he was a genius kind of musician, and he's in with the right band there.
So what's the state of rock as we moved into the new decade, in your opinion, as we ended the 90s?
It was diminished is a good word for it. It was in need of some tender loving care, but it was also in need of an audience that wanted it. And I think there was an audience, there was a rock audience, of course, but I think the mass audience taste had moved on. They wanted the pop stars. They wanted the rappers. They wanted EDM. They were interested in hybrid. If Britney Spears records "I Love Rock and Roll," even some of us may have blanched at that, but it worked for the audience. And that it was what the audience wanted. So rock needed to find something special to get its foothold back again, and it really hasn't since. The White Stripes certainly were part of that. The Strokes came along, but these were not bands that took over the world the same way Nirvana did, or that
Yeah.
Pearl Jam did, or Van Halen at
Yeah.
that time. It just we had really chopped up the market, I think, too much for a rock band to really do what those bands did.
Yeah, we didn't mention Pink Floyd's Division Bell. Was that in
That is not in the book.
It didn't make the year 1994. Okay.
No, we thought it was considered, and I thought a very good album. I should really look, because it's not like at my age, it's not like I can remember.
I'm just thinking of all the albums that weren't in there.
Albums, and that was that was a favorite of mine, certainly. But yeah, we didn't put it in the book, and I remember the discussion. And it did come down to that, it's not even an essential Pink Floyd album, as good as it is.
Yeah.
It's an essential non-Roger Waters era Pink Floyd album, but its competition is 2 others.
Yep.
So now obviously, come '80s book. Spoiler alert: the wall might be in it.
You think?
Well, the '80s book is done, so
Okay. Well, yeah,
it's current.
I'm not going to start any arguments at the end of this interview.
You can.
I'm
You
thinking
can.
of, I keep thinking of albums. Wait a minute. Did you mention that?
Oh yeah, no, I know. Listen, I think of that. It's like I have to go back, and sometimes there's that little drop in the pit of your stomach, like oh. But then there's also, so which one are you going to take out?
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like we created a book that I can hand to somebody and say, this was the '90s. Listen to all these albums, you will understand what the '90s was in music. And if it takes you other places, we've done our job, and we did cheat. I mean, all the entries have context about albums that came before, albums that might have come after. So they're mentioned in one way, shape, or form, but they are just not singled out as essential albums.
Before I ask you about that '80s book, this book is out now, November 5th. So when this episode airs, it's
I
gonna
was
be
going to
right
say
around the time.
we wanted to put it out on a date when nothing else was going on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, what's going on November 5th?
Yeah, nothing. Go buy the book.
Yeah, 501 essential albums of the '90s, the music fans' definitive guide. November 5th release date. You can find it wherever books are sold. And where can people find you online, Gary, if they want to reach out?
They can Graff on Music on X, Gary Graff on Music on Facebook, Real Graff on Music on Instagram.
Okay. Now tell me about the '80s book.
Yeah, '80s book is much the same format.
When are we going to see it?
As we're going to see it in May, I believe.
Okay.
It's and then hopefully after that it'll be the '70s, and then there will be a discussion about the '60s, or is it time to go into the 2000s?
Nice.
I hope we do. Personally, hope we would do the '60s first. That was the beginning of the golden era of the album.
Yeah.
And who wouldn't want to have to choose between all those Beatles albums about which album's going to be in the book?
Right.
And we had that problem in the '80s book. U2, REM, you know, Prince. Year after year, great album after great
Prince,
album.
yeah.
Oh,
Man.
those fights were even louder than the fights we had for the '90s book.
Did you leave out any Van Halen albums? I hope they're all in there.
Oh,
No.
in the
'80s.
'80s. Oh yeah, we couldn't have them all.
Damn you.
But
Damn you.
I feel like it is
The argument's already started on the next
they will,
one.
yeah, they will. I feel like it is a well-represented selection.
Okay. All right. I'm very curious. I'm looking forward to it. Gary, thanks so much. Awesome.
Thank you for having me. And we'll see you in the spring with the '80s.
Let's do it in the spring. Thanks so much, man.